Hi everyone, welcome to ECI 416. This is teaching exceptional students in the mainstream classroom. I hope you all are all ready for an awesome semester. And to kick us off, I have a couple little puzzles here to see if you can solve those. So you have one in the top right-hand corner and then another one in the bottom left-hand corner. So just take a second and see if you can figure those out. All right, so we're going to start with the one in the top right. If you guessed ready for anything, you are right. So as you see, the letter E is red, and then there are 4 anythings. So you're ready for anything, and that's a great way to start off our semester. And then in the bottom left puzzle is nothing good on TV. I know. These are great. I love it. I hope you found those fun. All right, let's get started. We have a few mini lecture goals for this module. I'll start with the welcome. We'll go through a bit of a course overview, and then we'll talk through some of the foundation of special education and then special education procedures and services, and we'll end with the wrap up. So I would like to welcome all of you to this class. My name is Dr. Jamie Pearson. I do prefer to go by Dr. Pearson or Dr. P. You can email me at any time. My email address is here. My phone number is also here. Just a quick note regarding contacting me via phone, or even if you want to stop by for face-to-face chat. I am in the process of moving offices from the 6th floor of Poe Hall to the 5th floor. So as of Monday, I should be moved in sort of to the 5th floor, but I'm still in transition. So I just wanted to let you know that. That also means that my phone may be out of order for a few days, but you can definitely reach me via email at any time. And I'm happy to find another place to meet with you. Even though my office is in between stages, I'm happy to meet with you at another location inside Poe. So again, welcome. I'm excited to have you all here. In terms of office hours, again, because this is an online class, I am more than happy to schedule those by appointment, and as needed, we could schedule those to be online via Google Hangout or FaceTime, Skype, or we can meet in person. So whatever works best for you. I am super flexible in that regard. So I will back up before I give that part away. There was one other thing I wanted to add, and I am going to forget it. So I will just in terms of introducing how the structure of the course will be, just so you have an idea. You're like, how long is this about to be? I typically try to do audio lectures that are anywhere from maybe 30-ish minutes. Sometimes they go up to an hour. We'll see how long this one is because I have a lot of intro material and I want to talk through the assignments on the syllabus and then cover a little bit of lecture material as well. But the idea for these audio lectures is to provide you a foundation of the content and to give some examples and to help you kind of tie in what you're reading at home with ways to apply that in practice. So giving you some examples of application. I'm not necessarily doing these to regurgitate what you've already read in your books. So that's just to kind of give you an idea for the purpose of these audio modules or audio lectures. So there are about 14 of you, so about half of our class found the golden nugget that was hidden in the letter, at least until this point. So there may be a few more people who send those before the deadline, but at the point of this recording, at least, there were 14 of you who saw the little golden nugget in the introduction letter that I sent out last week. And that means you were reading very closely, so thank you. For those of you who missed it, it's perfectly okay. The people who found it got 2 bonus points. And so I wanted to share these Netflix or movie suggestions with all of you because I thought, well, hey, they'd like to know what these are too. I have quite the list going now because honestly, I've only actually seen One Tree Hill, How to Get Away with Murder, but not all of the seasons. Orange is the New Black. I think that's it. So I have a lot on my list. The numbers that are in parentheses by a few of these, like Stranger Things, The Office, and The Handmaid's Tale, those just represent the number of people who recommended those. So you can see there are a few that are pretty popular, especially Stranger Things. I've heard a lot about that, so I think I'm going to start off with that one. You'll see that there are a couple that may be movies. I might have missed some other ones that are actually movies instead of series, so I'm sure you can figure it out. And then there are a couple that are on Hulu and not necessarily Netflix. So in the free time that you have, because I know as college students you have all the free time, right? And probably not. But anyways, this might be fun for you too, so I thought I would share. And again, I thank those of you who participated and found the golden nugget and sent in your recommendations. It's just a nice way to get us started and to make sure that you understand all of the expectations for the course. Okay. So in terms of the overview, our goals for this course are to help you be able to identify and explain evidence-based strategies and ways that you can modify the instruction that you use for students with disabilities. Our second goal is to really be able to develop an understanding of the disability characteristics, and then to be able to focus on the needs of the individual student. So we're going to talk about the disability categories, but I don't want you all to get so caught up on like, oh, this is a student with autism or this is a student with EBD, but really learning how to apply the necessary modifications or the necessary accommodations to support that particular student and not necessarily the disability category that has been attached to that person. The goals also include completing assignments, class presentations, and a final project that demonstrate your application of inclusive teaching. So I know that all of you are middle grades pre-service teachers for the most part, and one of the things that we're going to focus on primarily in this class is engaging in inclusive teaching. And so we'll talk about what that means within the context of supporting children with disabilities. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're embedding values of respect for diverse learners. And I would like to say that I think about that in a number of ways, right? So when we think about diversity, we're not only thinking about cultural differences, racial differences, religious differences, but we're also thinking about intellectual diversity, right? And supporting those who are students with disabilities, who have different intellectual needs, who have different learning needs, right? So thinking about diversity in a broader context is super important, okay? So for the structure of this class, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this audio lecture, these will go anywhere from, 30 to an hour. What happens is usually I hop on and I say, okay, this is going to be a 30-minute lecture, and I end up talking for way longer than that. So I'm not even going to promise you all that they're going to be a specific amount of time. I would say just give yourself an hour each week. I will definitely do my best to keep it under an hour because I think more than that is a bit much. And it's just kind of hard to even record that long and upload them in a decent amount of time. So from a logistics standpoint, they will probably not go over an hour, but anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. So that's for the audio lecture. And then I will also post the actual PowerPoint itself, so the presentation. So once you are on module 1, you'll see how it's organized. I'll have the audio lecture and then the accompanying presentation that goes along with that. So you can listen to me and then you can kind of go back and just click through the presentation by itself, and you don't have to listen to me at the same time, whatever your preference might be. If you're able to catch all of the material without even listening to me, that's fine too. Whatever you need to be able to make sure you are gathering, the content, learning the content. There will probably be things in these audio lectures that you would want to listen to, so I don't necessarily encourage you to not listen, but if you can always click through or whatever if you're like, okay, Dr. P, I already know that part. But I would definitely encourage you to kind of at least kind of listen at the beginning and the end when I might send out reminders or kind of talk about things that are changing, just so that you are clear on all of that. My goal is to really make this online class feel as close to a face-to-face as possible, while also really appreciating the flexibility that this provides. So in terms of the structure, you will have weekly reflections. I'll talk a little bit more about those when we look at the syllabus. We will also be engaging in these super exciting immersion activities, and I'll talk a bit more about those as well. I'd also really like it if you if you would share some of your experiences in the field. I know you all are in different places in terms of your placements. I don't think anyone is in like full takeover this semester in terms of student teaching, but I'm sure that many of you have some classes where you're probably doing some classroom-based activities or coursework that's related to the field, or even more generally, if you have experiences with students with disabilities as a summer camp leader, camp counselor, things like that. Feel free to share those experiences either in your reflections, or if we ever do kind of a synchronous session where you're able to share some responses in the messages, etc. So I really hope that you will make this practical and be able to take away what we have, the content in this class, and be able to apply it to your practice. And also, let's have fun. I know that many of you, it looks like our seniors, we have a good bit of juniors and seniors, are getting close to the end. It wasn't that terribly long ago where I was where you are, so I understand how busy things are, and I really strive to make this class informative and as fun as possible. I know special ed content can sometimes be a bit overwhelming, especially if you aren't familiar with it, but we'll work through it together, okay? For housekeeping and course guidelines, I kind of hinted towards this just a second ago, but really try to treat this like a face-to-face class, okay? So you might want to set aside a time. I know many of you work and you are in clubs and extracurricular activities. So if it's best for you to set aside a time, like, okay, every week on Wednesday evenings, I'm going to set aside 2 hours, 3 hours to work on my ECI 416 course, do that, okay? Find what works for you. If it's better for you to do 30 minutes a night, do that. But do try to treat it like a face-to-face class so that you're able to just sit down and spend some time engaging with the audio lecture and engaging with any activities that are posted on our Moodle site. Please do be respectful, and that means, in this context, that means being on time for synchronous activities. Obviously, we are not meeting face-to-face. In the event that we do have a scheduled office hours meeting, that would be probably just the two of us, one of you and me. Please do be on time for that as well. But in general, please be on time for synchronous activities. That primarily includes the immersion activities that I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. But you definitely want to log on for those even early to make sure you're all set to go. Value your peer contributions. So whenever your peers share things in the discussion boards, please do value those and be respectful and engage and be responsive to those contributions. And then value the diversity of our classroom in terms of student backgrounds, your majors, where you're from. All of those pieces really contribute to the richness of our classroom culture. And I value that as the instructor, and I really hope that that is something you value as well. So let's talk through the assignments. This might get a little clunky just for a second because I'm going to click on this link to open up the syllabus, and then I'll walk through that. But generally, you will have weekly reflections, as I discussed. These are your major assignments for the course. You will have an initial inclusion paper, and then you will do a disability investigation presentation. We will have the immersion experiences, and then finally you will have your final inclusion paper and guide. So I'm just going to click this screenshot of the syllabus and take us to the syllabus here. And again, you see the course description. All of this is available on the Moodle site. It's linked to my Google page because, I'm sure you all have had classes where the instructor or one of the students catches errors after the fact, right? And so I like to leave it linked to my Google site, my Google Docs, and that way I can make changes as needed. So we're just going to walk through the assignments and evaluation really quickly. So your weekly reflections are to be anywhere between 150 to 200 words. So each week I will post a prompt, and then I will ask you to respond to that prompt. And it'll be related to our topic for that week or the reading. Sometimes it'll be like a video or something like a current event. And then you will be required to kind of engage in a response that demonstrates the fact that you have read and that you've reflected, and you're not just kind of regurgitating anything. You're not just writing a summary, but you're really applying the knowledge that you've gained to this particular prompt. And so these prompts will be available along with the entire module each Monday morning by 8 a.m. And I ask that you submit these on Sundays no later than 11:55 p.m. I will drop your lowest 2 reflection grades. So there are actually going to be 14 opportunities to do a weekly reflection, and you only need to do 12 of those. Or, I mean, you could do all 14, but if for some reason, let's say you only get a 3 on one and a 4 on one, then I would drop those 2. Or if you know you're going to be traveling a particular week and you just want to skip that one altogether, and then you get to the end of the semester and you're like, oh, I'm fine, I have a perfect score on everything, I'll just skip the last one, that's perfect. Okay, so just know that you could skip 2, or I will drop your lowest 2. And that's a total of 60 points for your weekly reflections. The discussion forums, there are going to be 3 discussion forums over the course of the semester, and these are designed to create an engaging space for you as peers and colleagues in the classroom to create a stronger kind of learning environment amongst yourselves. And so you will foster your own learning through dynamic discussions and reflective thinking. So you will participate in 1 discussion forum per unit. Those will probably, the way they're kind of organized, I don't want to make you all dizzy, but the way they're organized in terms of the schedule is that they will fall on your immersion weeks. So your discussion forums will actually be an opportunity for you to reflect on your immersion activities that we'll talk about in a second. The initial inclusion paper is, this is going to be a pretty short paper that sort of introduces your own perspective around what is inclusion, right? So you wanted to explain your current thoughts and experiences about special education, and you're going to include any personal or professional experiences that you've had with people with disabilities. And then you want to kind of share what you think what your experiences have been and what you think it means to engage in inclusive practices, or if you think inclusion is appropriate for students with disabilities, and what you think that might be, and how your opinion has been formed or informed by literature, popular culture, etc. This is not required. You're not required to have references. This is really an opinion piece where you're sharing your thoughts and your opinion about what inclusion is and how that opinion has been formed over the years. The disability investigation is one of my favorite assignments for this course. So it's a little bit different in the online context. I typically do this in pairs, but you're going to do them individually. And what you will do is choose a specific disability category, and I will ask that we will probably not sign up for them. I think it's okay if each student chooses whatever you're interested in. I'm thinking through this as I'm talking, because in the past I have them pair up and then choose one category so that we're represented. But I think you can just choose any of the categories. And then you're going to create a 15-minute presentation that you will upload to Moodle, and it will be shared with your peers. And this presentation will provide information about the characteristics, any learning challenges, any effective teaching and behavior management strategies for students with disabilities. And then as part of the presentation, you should also demonstrate at least one effective teaching strategy. So it might be a little tricky to demonstrate, but you can show examples of ways that would be effective teaching strategies. I will also post some examples of that before we get to that unit. And I will provide some clarity about the expectations for choosing a disability category, because I'm still thinking through that as we're talking. Because there are about 28 of you and there are 13 disability categories, I will probably ask that you sign up for them. And that's just because I don't want everyone to choose, for example, autism or physical orthopedic impairments or EBD. I want you all to choose different disability categories so that at the end you have your own little notebook that you could use as a resource that has disability investigation presentations for all 13 categories and not just a group of 3 or 4 of them. Okay, so I'll add some specific clarifications regarding that piece before we get to that component. Your inclusive guide, inclusive teaching paper has a proposal component, and this is to really get you started thinking about what you will write about for your final inclusive teaching paper. So I ask that you submit a 1-page description of your proposed inclusive teaching guide, and the purpose is to explain how you want to approach your inclusive teaching guide, and you should indicate the grade level. So you will describe to me, these are the activities that I propose to engage in to ensure that all learners in my classroom are receiving free and appropriate public education. We'll talk more about what that means in a second. And that all learners have access to the curriculum as needed, and that all learners have the supports that they need to learn successfully in my classroom. Okay, so you will just kind of submit a proposal that says, hey, Dr. P, these are the things that I'm planning to do in my final inclusion paper. The next activity is the immersion experience. I am super excited about this because I have been working with some of the researchers who developed immersion, which used to be called Teach Live. This is a really cool virtual reality-based software or tool that's been designed to help pre-service teachers and professionals in other fields learn how to problem solve or engage in, learning in contexts that are virtual. And so you will have an opportunity to use immersion software 3 times throughout the semester, and you will engage with virtual students who reflect the diverse academic, behavioral, and socio-emotional needs of middle school learners. So the coolest part about this is that right now, the immersion company only has, they have elementary grades, lower elementary grades learners that I think they just released. But the middle grades learners have been out for a couple years, and it's really cool. So it's nice that it fits well within our class. So I know it was kind of difficult getting the scheduling down. We have to schedule in advance when we will access the sessions, and I'll talk more about how to do that when I get back to the PowerPoint. I don't want to get too far off from what I'm talking about. So just understand that the immersion experience each one is worth 10 points. They are mandatory. They're required. So there were maybe a couple people, I think there was only one person, but there may have been one other person who could only do 1 day. I want to make sure that I've done my best to make sure that everyone can attend these. I strongly encourage you to try to rearrange your schedule or take a lunch break if there are conflicts with the dates of these experiences, because it is a major part of the class, and I think a very valuable part, right? So I encourage you to make sure that you're able to attend these and engage in appropriate interactions and reflections. So as I mentioned earlier, you have a discussion board that goes along with the immersion experience for each of those weeks. So if you miss the immersion experience, then you're also going to miss the points for the discussion board because you won't have had an immersion experience to reflect on. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. The dates are there. We'll walk through those again when I get back to the PowerPoint, but they're there so you can plan well ahead of time. Finally, your inclusive teaching paper and guide is worth 50 points. This is going to be a final paper that reflects how your personal philosophy has changed over the course. So I'm going to ask you to develop a guide for a specific subject and or grade level, and you're going to describe in practical terms what you will do to engage in inclusive teaching. So you can draw from the text, you can use our class-based activities and presentations or other resources that you have gathered over the course, and you really just want to develop a guide that's a practical tool that you could use when you're out in the field. So when you're a first year teacher and you're like, oh wow, I have 2 students in my classroom who have IEPs or 2 students with disabilities, and I really want to make sure that I am providing them the best support so that every learner in my classroom is getting the supports that they need. Here's a quick guide that I can go to. Let me pull out my guide that I developed in Dr. P's class, okay? So it's a narrative writing that you do yourself. This isn't going to be a summary of, resources that you found or a summary of what you read in the textbook. It's really going to be a how-to, right? It's a problem-solving, troubleshooting kind of guide that you're going to use. And it will describe you. It'll be your description regarding how you will function as an effective, inclusive, general, or special education teacher. I say or special because sometimes I teach this class and then at the end of the semester, I get a couple students who are like, Dr. P, I'm actually thinking more about special education. So if that's the case for you, let's talk, okay? And then as a final component to the inclusive teaching assignment, you will present your final paper and the inclusion guide to myself and then a small group of your peers during your scheduled presentation time. I'm realizing as I'm reading through this that there's not a specified page page limit on this paper, but I think it's on the description. So I will go back and make sure that that is clear. So let's hop back into our presentation and see if I missed anything. We'll talk through each of those assignments. If you have any questions about the assignments, always feel free to reach out. Sometimes they tend to be a little murky beforehand, but once you read through the assignment description, I always talk through them again before they're due, like in the maybe 2 weeks before the first assignment is due, and then this next one, I always kind of give an opportunity to reach out so that we can talk more about those, and I give specific reminders about what's to be included in those so that everyone is clear. So the textbook, I've gotten a few emails about that. The 7th edition of including students with special needs is perfectly fine. I believe that one is still a loose leaf version. That's the version that I will be teaching from. I do understand that the that the bookstore has the 8th edition. That one is also fine. It probably has a little bit, a few different like examples. The page numbers might be off a bit, but the chapters are the same. So if you're listening to this and you don't yet have the textbook, then understand that either version is fine. If you already have your textbook, then great, because it's time to get going. If you asked about the access card and you're still not sure, that we don't need that. So no need to purchase the access card that goes along, or code that goes along with the textbook, okay? So the 7th or the 8th edition is fine, and you do not need the access code. If you're having financial issues with getting a book or any other issues related to the book, please let me know as soon as possible, okay? Because these chapters are they're not too dense, but again, it's pretty novel information for most of the students in this class, and so you definitely want to stay on top of the readings. So if you don't have your book kind of on the way, you want to check in and make sure that you're going to have that as soon as possible. And if not, we can make arrangements for you to borrow a book temporarily if needed. Okay. So as I mentioned, the immersion activities. The days for those are going to be Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. So we have these activities 3 times. They're always going to be on a Monday, Tuesday, and a Wednesday. And the weeks for these are September 10th, 11th, 12th. That'll be our first immersion experience. Your second one will be October 15th, 16th, and 17th. And the third one will be November 26th, 27th, and 28th. And then your options for times are 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. So during these days, dates, and times, you only need to sign up for one 1-hour block. So let's pretend that I'm a student in the classroom. For week 1, for our September immersion activity, I'm going to choose the Tuesday, September 11th Tuesday, September 11th at 7 p.m. So I'm going to be I'm going to sign up for the first slot on Tuesday, September 11th at 7 p.m. That's all I need to sign up for that week. I don't need to choose another day or another time, just that one slot. And that'll be the same process for October and November. So you choose the day, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, the date, obviously, that corresponds with that day, and the time that works best for you, okay? So the dates are pretty much set. It's just deciding whether the day or the time, which day and time works best for you during the week. This is linked to the sign-up sheet, so I'm not going to click because I want to keep flowing through this presentation because I'm already behind, I'm sure. But you are encouraged to click here, and it'll take you to the sign-up sheet, and go ahead and just plug your names in. Right now, there are only 5 spaces for each session. If for some reason, if we're running into issues with more than 5 people needing to sign up, just contact me and we'll take it from there. I'm hoping that these will work out pretty evenly. We have 28 people and 30 slots, so I'm hoping that we can balance these out. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there if there's an issue. So we're going to use Zoom for these immersion activities. I have the link here, so you can click here to kind of see how to get started. Below that is our meeting ID. So this is a meeting ID that you will use to access immersion. And these are the steps to use Zoom. So you will open that the link, which will let you join. You'll type in our ID, the ID number for my class. It's my ID for this. And then you will join audio conference by computer. And then at the bottom, if I can move my hover, it'll say start video and mute. Because we're going to be doing this in a group setting, you will want to turn off your video and then also mute your sound until it's your turn. And what we will likely do is have you go in the order that you are signed up on the page. So for example, if Connor is number 1, he will be the first student to engage with the immersion students or the immersion parents. And then whoever is number 2, if Sarah is next, then she will engage second. So we'll just go with the order that you sign up. And that way you will know when it's your turn to unmute yourself and to turn on your video. This is going to be a bit of trial and error to see how many people can be on at one time. It might slow us down, like your internet speeds and the capacity of Zoom with multiple people. It slows things down a little bit, but we think that 5 people should be fine. If we're running into big problems with more than 5 people being on, or if we run into an issue that we need more than 5 people, we'll try to see how that works by adding 1 additional person at a time. And then finally, when we're finished with our immersion experience, you will leave meeting. So you'll just click down here. Each of these sessions will actually only be 50 minutes, so it's not even a full hour. So that's why it's important for you to log on early so that you're ready to go. And we'll start at exactly 6 p.m. or exactly 7 p.m. and we will stop at exactly 6:50 or exactly 7:50. So each person will have about 10 minutes to engage in that particular scenario, and that will also leave us some time for transitions in between. If you have additional questions about immersion, please feel free to reach out. This is going to be a learning experience for both of us for the online setting. I've worked with immersion in face-to-face classes before, or at least observed it, but we'll be learning together in this instance. So just be patient. Our first one might be a little rough, but we'll know how to work it after that, and then we'll go from there. I hope I'm really confident that you will enjoy it. So let's just see how it goes, and we'll go from there. So now I think that's all of our intro in terms of the course logistics. I probably should have done that in a separate presentation, but we're going to keep rolling, okay? So think and share if you can, or think and pair and share if there's like someone around you who you just want to bounce some ideas off of. Draft a quick concept map that reflects what you know about special education, okay? What do you know about special education? Just kind of think about that. What does it consist of? How do you define it? What does it even mean? All right, so special education includes specially designed instruction or instructional practices um, that address the needs of learners who learn differently or have different learning needs. Special education also includes related services like speech language therapy, special transportation, physical therapy. It might include things like adaptive PE. And then two of the things that you will probably hear about a lot as they're related to special education are accommodations and modifications. So these are supplementary aids and services that we provide for students who have disabilities so that they can maximize their learning potential in the classroom. So everything that we do in special education is governed by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, also known as IDEA. So you will probably hear me refer to that as IDEA from here on out. So that is the federally mandated law, essentially, that guarantees, that protects students with disabilities, and it promises them, essentially, guarantees them they're legally entitled to services that meet their needs in public schools in the United States. So this is also referred to as PL 94-142. It was signed into law in 1975, and it was originally referred to as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. We don't use that language anymore, so it's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it guarantees a free and appropriate public education to every child with a disability. Point blank, period. Okay? So when we say free and appropriate public education, what are we talking about? So we're going to try to kind of think through some of this lingo, get through some of the language. Free and appropriate public education is FAPE, and this is one of the 6 pieces, if you will, of IDEA. Free and appropriate public education. The second component is least restrictive environment. So this means that the setting that the students are in is most like that for other students in which they can succeed with appropriate supports. So if it's a student, for example, who has autism spectrum disorder, and he or she is pretty verbal but has some behavioral challenges and is performing at or close to grade level, that means that that student would probably be in one of your general education classes, and maybe he or she is pulled out for a few minutes of speech and a few minutes of behavioral therapy. But there is no, given this really brief kind of general background of this student, though that description of that student would not require him or her to be placed in a special education classroom full time, most likely. Okay, so the idea is that your students with disabilities are in the least restrictive environment possible, such that they are able to learn, but also such that they are in a safe space. Okay, so there's always a balance. We have to find the balance between least restrictive and what makes the most sense for that learner. Individualized education program. So the IEP is the third component of the IDEA. And this is, again, a legally binding document that specifies any accommodations or supports that the student will be receiving. It describes the goals for that student and how the teachers, be it special education, general education, specials teachers, will engage in specific inclusive practices to meet the needs of the learner. So this is a binding document. It's important that you understand what's in the IEP. It's important that you understand the goals for your students. Even if you're a general education teacher who sees one student with a disability for like 30 minutes out of the day, it doesn't matter how little, you want to make sure that you really understand this IEP. The IDEA also mandates non-discriminatory evaluation. So this means that we're using evaluations and assessments that are not culturally biased, and that they are implemented with fidelity, meaning the way they were designed to be implemented, and that they are implemented with fidelity across settings, okay, so that other professionals are using them in the same way. The fifth component of IDEA is due process. And we don't like to hear a lot about due process in special education because that means something has gone way wrong. Due process is the legal right that parents have to seek restitution for any injustice, essentially, that their child has faced. So if a child is not receiving the appropriate services, especially as written in the IDEA, then parents have the opportunity to go to mediation, to discuss what's been happening and why it hasn't been happening. And sometimes that ends up going to court. People try to settle those sorts of issues within the school district or the local education agency, also known as the LEA. But sometimes due process ends up results in court cases. And then finally, we have, zero reject and child find. And this essentially means that we don't reject any child who has a disability for special education services. And it also means that if you know a child has a disability, that you refer them for services or make someone aware. So there are a number of important elements of IDEA. The general education teacher is a member of this team. The teachers need to be highly qualified in their core content. And so you'll also probably learn that special education teachers in the state of North Carolina specifically are certified to teach K through 12. So that is a little bit different whenever you are certified in a particular grade level or range, elementary or middle grades, etc. So teachers are sometimes general education teachers are working with special ed teachers who work with a wide range of learners. And you just kind of have to learn how to work best with each other. Another piece of the IDEA that's critical is that students must be included in their assessment, and then that parents participate. This is a really big one for me, especially because a lot of the research I do focuses on supporting parents. And so you will probably hear me talk a lot about, from the parent perspective, how it's important to engage with parents in your practices. So there are also discipline considerations when we think about the needs of students with disabilities and how they may exhibit behavioral concerns. There are transition services for students. So Part C of IDEA is early intervention and early childhood services. So these are for students who are birth to 3 years old. I'm 97.4% sure that none of you will be working in EI, but it's good to know. And then Part B are the services for children and adolescents ages 3 through 21. So you should know that learners who have an IEP can stay in public schools until they are 21. Technically, they can stay in schools until the day before their 22nd birthday. So not when they turn 21, but just before they turn 22. So that's a legal mandate that's within the IDEA. And then we also want to pay attention to disproportionate representation. We'll see this and talk a little bit more about this as we go through the course, but you might learn even in some of your settings or any of your experiences thus far where you see these classrooms that have disproportionate representations of particular cultural groups or racial groups of students or gendered groups of students in, like, for example, a resource classroom or a behavior classroom. They're often comprised of behavior classrooms, especially tend to be Black boys, okay? And depending on how the classrooms are organized, we see underrepresentation of Latino and African American students with autism. So when you walk into an autism classroom, they typically don't represent or reflect the diversity that we should see in autism classrooms. Another side piece is that, or side nugget, not a side piece, is that I do research on autism, cultural diversity, supporting families. So I probably will use a lot of examples that relate to autism and families and diversity, but just some things to know. So because I'm taking quite a while to get through this, I'm not going to talk through each slide. These are some of the historical and political events that led to the development of special education. You will read about those in your textbook as well. So I'm just going to click through these. This is some of the legislation. Brown versus Board, for example, was actually a big piece that contributed to the development of special education. I know we think about that more so in terms of racial sort of experiences, but it definitely contributed to equal education opportunities for all children, not just necessarily based on racial differences, but for those who have disabilities as well. The current civil rights legislation, we talked about the IEP or the IDEA, but we also have Section 504. So there may be students who have 504 plans, which are different from IEPs, and we'll talk more about what those mean later in the presentation or in the course. But just be familiar with that term. And then we also have the Americans with Disabilities Act. This originated actually at the University of Illinois, where I did my PhD, and the act didn't originate there, but kind of the implementation of the act originated there, where they started making the cutouts for wheelchairs. And so that's an example of an ADA compliant sort of physical space, or like elevators, etc. So things that are making spaces more accessible for individuals with disabilities. So the Americans with Disabilities Act. There was something else I was going to add on to that. I'll think about it in a second. It's related to NC State, and I'll come back to that if I think of it. So why does a general education teacher need to know about special education? I get this question a lot. I kind of get blank looks from students who are in gen ed because they don't necessarily expect to have learners who have disabilities in their classrooms. And folks, I really want to let you know, I can almost guarantee you that you will have students with disabilities in your classrooms, okay? So you want to be prepared for that. It's not something to be afraid of. It's not something to be worried about. It's important just to understand that that's the reality, and that it's actually a really good thing to know that learners who learn differently or face challenges can learn alongside their typically developing peers, okay? Because we've had a history of separation of students with disabilities into these self-contained or segregated classrooms. And this happened in many cases where students were fully capable of learning with their peers. And so knowing that you're going to have students with disabilities in your classrooms is important. I think it can, cause a little bit of fear or reservations going into it, but that's exactly why we have this class, is so that you understand more about what their needs are and how to support them, and that you can provide the inclusive supports, create the inclusive environment that will support the needs of these learners. We're seeing current trends. We're seeing pretty steady increases. We thought that the prevalence of autism had tapered off, but we saw that it climbed again this past year. We're seeing more behavior support needs for many students. We're seeing increases in the prevalence of ADHD. We'll talk about whether or not that's a disability category later on. But we're also seeing much more work in terms of creating inclusive environments for these learners, meaning that they will be served in general education classrooms. It might be that some of you even co-teach with a special education teacher, which will be really exciting and something great to see. So there's some important legislation that impacts all of the education. I'm sure many of you have already talked about these in in some of your early classes. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, No Child Left Behind Act, and Every Student Succeeds Act. These all have an impact on students in special education as well. Sometimes the impact is a little bit different. I'll let you read through some of that, and if you have more specific questions, we'll address that as we go throughout the semester. So there are some tools and some policies in place and practices in place to kind of prevent the need for special education. And a couple of these are response to intervention, positive behavior supports, and multi-tiered systems of supports. Going into middle schools, many of you will hear lots about these. I'm sure many of you have already heard lots about PBIS and MTSS in North Carolina schools especially. So I will be really excited to hear more about what your experiences have been in terms of preventing the need for special education. So RTI, response to intervention, is a 3-tiered support system. And so at tier 1, you're providing your core classroom instruction to all of your learners. And it's a targeted system because the goal is that you are identifying students who are struggling and who need additional supports. And once you identify those learners, they go to tier 2, where they receive targeted instruction in small groups. And you collect data, you analyze that data, you say, okay, they're still struggling or they're meeting these goals, so they're fine. And then if they need more supports, they go to intensive individual interventions where they're receiving very intense supports at tier 3. But the idea is that tiers 1, 2, and 3 are preventative strategies that help support learners before they get sent to special education. So general education teachers are taking more responsibility for addressing the needs of learners who might have learning challenges, but not necessarily a disability that requires them to need special education services. Okay? Similarly, the multi-tiered system of support, it's a multi-tiered framework similar to RTI, but it improves the school-based learning as a whole. And so North Carolina employs a systems approach, and we're really trying to make this be data-driven and solve problems that maximize the growth for everyone. So it's bringing the RTI together with the behavioral system. So we're not just focusing on the academics and just the behavior, but we're bringing them together to serve the needs of students at 3 different levels related to both academics and behavior. Again, you can read through some of these. We have accountability and expectations for all teachers as it's related to assessment and professional accountability and access to the general curriculum. We'll talk through that when we go through the appropriate chapter. Evidence-based practices are super important because there are a number of interventions and strategies that people are kind of throwing out there, but we don't have a lot of evidence base that suggests that they are truly effective for students with disabilities. And so you want to make sure that the strategies, the practices, the instructional tools that you're using, that they are actually grounded in empirical research, okay? You want to find high quality studies that have determined their effectiveness. We want to close this gap between research and practice. So a lot of times we have all of these researchers who are doing all of this research in these settings, but then it's not being applied to practice to really see what that application is like. So that's part of what we're doing in special education, is saying, okay, Fuchs and Fuchs have done all of this work around students with learning disabilities. Now, how do we apply what they've recommended, right? And then we want to eliminate the use of practices that are not supported by research. We tend to get into habits, right? We like to kind of do things that we're used to. But if we learn that timeout is not effective for early learners who have disabilities, then we need to stop using those sorts of strategies, right? So you want to eliminate the use of things that are not supported by research. All right, so I am going to encourage you to take a break at this point. Again, as I mentioned early on, I'd like to treat this as a face-to-face class. And so I would encourage you to pause, just take a breather. You could click back through, see if there's anything you missed, or you might want to pause and actually look through the actual PowerPoint, the presentation that accompanies this, whatever you want to do. And then when you're ready, come back and we'll keep going. All right, so part 2 of this will probably be much more quick because I spent a lot of time on the front end with the introductions. But hopefully you did take a break and actually kind of try to digest some of this before moving forward. So a lot of what we will talk about in this class are inclusive practices to support the needs of diverse learners. An IDEA requires a range of settings, and it emphasizes careful consideration of placement to be as inclusive as possible. So that means having learners with disabilities be on the carpet at calendar time with the rest of their peers. Another little side piece of information is that I work primarily with elementary age students, so a lot of times I tend to give elementary aged examples, but I'll try to do a better job of giving examples for middle grade learners. So the dimensions of inclusive practices includes physical integration. So in the example I just gave, that they're sitting on this carpet, sharing that same space with their peers. It includes social integration. So when you're doing think, pair, shares about the solar system, that all of your students are engaged in pairs, that they're grouped appropriately. And it includes instructional integration. So if you have a student with a visual impairment, you are using adaptive instruction or accommodations or modifications to support them. So maybe they're sitting in the front, but they're still beside their peers. Maybe they have a magnifying glass. Maybe you print their worksheet in a larger font. But whatever you're doing is supporting them in an inclusive environment, okay? It doesn't mean that they are in a special education classroom because they have a visual impairment. It means that in the general education classroom, we use inclusive practices to support their needs, okay? So we used to hear a lot about this term called mainstreaming, and I want to talk a little bit about what the differences are. So inclusion includes understanding your school community. It's not just about the IEPs. It's providing flexible learning, and it's everyone's responsibility, okay? So you value everyone, you value other cultures. You're being inclusive of the diversity of what everyone brings to your classroom. And so the outcomes of inclusive practices include student achievement, positive perceptions from parents because they feel like they're part of this decision making and they want to be more collaborative. And then sometimes the teacher perceptions can vary, but most often I think when teachers see the positive outcomes from parents and their students, then they also feel pretty comfortable and confident about engaging in inclusive practices. So take a second to think about your own experiences with students with disabilities. So maybe when you were in middle school, do you remember having students who you knew had disabilities? Sometimes we don't know, so we don't want to assume. Sometimes we do know. So think back about that. What were some of the practices that your teachers used to make those students feel more included or to make sure they were engaged? Okay? Think about that, and then think about how you might use some of those same practices in your place. And also think more specifically about the types of disability. So if you know for sure that you had a peer who had cerebral palsy, or you knew for sure that one of your friends in elementary school was diagnosed with autism, just kind of think specifically about the type of disability and the type of inclusion practices that your teachers used to support your peers. And that leads us to our IDEA disability categories, okay? So there are 13 categories that fall under the IDEA legislation, and those include learning disability, intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, autism, hearing impairment, which you will notice is different from deaf, which is also different from deaf blindness, okay? Visual impairment, speech or language impairment, orthopedic impairment, traumatic brain injury, other health impaired, multiple disabilities, and developmental delay. Developmental delay has an asterisk because children can only be diagnosed with or labeled with developmental delay until they are 8, at which point they have to have one of the preceding disability categories be attached if it still applies. The reason that even exists is because there are many cases where students just have a developmental delay, and then they catch up. And so after age 8, they no longer need special education services, okay? If they still have a developmental delay or issue after age 8, it has to be determined that falls into one of these other categories. So for example, many students who are first labeled with a developmental delay, we later learn that they have autism or that they have an intellectual disability. And then in many of the others, we learn that we have supported them well enough that they no longer need special ed services. And so that is our ultimate goal. So these are the 13 disability categories. I'm sure some of you are wondering, what about ADHD? We hear so much about ADHD, and it is not on the list. So the high incidence disability categories are those that account for 80% of the students with disabilities. Learning disabilities, speech language impairments, mild intellectual disabilities, and emotional disturbance. These are the most common categories of disability among students with disabilities in the US. Now, we hear a lot of chatter about autism, right? Technically, it is not considered a high incidence disability. Even though it's very common, at this point, it's not yet considered a high incidence disability. There is talk, though, about kind of seeing it push towards that sort of categorization, because it is the prevalence is so high. But in terms of meeting the needs of students with in special education, so like in terms of having autism to the extent that you need an IEP, it's not yet considered a high incidence disability. Secondly, ADHD is not technically one of the 13 categories. Now, we'll talk a little bit about what constitutes a disability. One of those things is that you first have to have one of these disability categories, and then it has to severely impact the student's ability to learn. And one of the things that we know about ADHD is that it is not technically a category, one of the 13 disability categories. And instead, many students who have severe ADHD are actually diagnosed with an other health impairment or other health impaired, to the extent that their ADHD has a significant impact on their ability to learn. So if it interferes with their ability to learn, if it's significantly impacting their functioning in school, then we sometimes see students who have ADHD that receive services under the category of under other health impaired. But it's important to understand that ADHD in and of itself is not a category. Also, if I repeated anything or if this just sounds a little disjointed, it's because someone FaceTimed me and I forgot to turn that off. I'm still getting back into the swing of things for the new semester too, so I apologize about that, but we're going to keep going and wrap this up shortly. Low incidence disabilities are comprised of moderate to severe intellectual disability. So for those individuals who have more significant intellectual challenges, we see fewer of those. We see fewer students who have multiple disabilities, hearing impairments, visual impairments, orthopedic impairments, or quote unquote other health impairments. Autism is considered a low incidence disability, as is deaf blindness, traumatic brain injury, and developmental delays. Now, sometimes you will see, classrooms full of students with just autism, or you will see classrooms of students who have Down syndrome, which is considered a mild to moderate intellectual disability, or moderate to severe in many cases. And so you might assume we see this a lot. This must be a high incidence disability. But the high incidence disabilities are those students that you will most often see in your general education classroom. So remember earlier when I said I can pretty much guarantee you that you will be teaching students with disabilities. These will often be students with learning disabilities like dyslexia or dyscalculia, students with speech and language impairments, students who have mild intellectual disabilities, students who have behavior problems or challenges. And then although autism is a low incidence disability, I can almost guarantee you that you will see someone in your class with autism, and you will more likely than not have students with ADHD. Okay, so we'll talk more through the categories as we go through the semester, but it's important to just kind of familiarize yourself with what they are, and we'll learn more about what each disability category is as we go through. We often also have students with other special needs who are gifted and talented, or those who are protected by Section 504. So the 504 means that students need additional supports, but they do not need them to, but they don't actually meet the requirements for an IEP. So maybe they have a physical disability, which is one of the 13 categories, an orthopedic impairment, for example, but that orthopedic impairment doesn't significantly impact their ability to learn. I always use my younger brother as an example for this. He has a brachial plexus injury on his left arm, and so that injury had, when he was in school, it impacted his ability to kind of complete work. Like he needed assistance holding his paper down, and even with his pencil grip. So he needed some of that occupational supports. He needed more time for exams, but it didn't impact his cognitive skills. And so he had a Section 504 plan, which granted him extra time on exams and support with like tying his shoes and at lunch, things like that. But it didn't require him to have modifications or adaptations that were significantly were strongly connected to his education in terms of the content, for example. We also have students who are at risk. I actually struggle with that term myself. It's probably something I want to take off this slide now that I'm talking through it. But you want to think about, you really want to qualify what at risk means in your settings. Sometimes we have classrooms of students who are at risk for developing a disability because they have faced trauma, or they have been diagnosed with a developmental delay, which means they have the potential to be diagnosed with a disability. And so in those cases, we might use a 504 plan to support those learners as well. So these are some additional procedures. The professionals who are involved in special education, I'll let you read through those. How might you decide if a student needs a disability? We use our own judgment, and then we also engage in universal screening. So you want to recognize patterns. You want to see if things are becoming worse, if students' needs are becoming worse over time. You want to determine if behaviors or learning is significantly different from classmates. And then you want to recognize the absence of a pattern can be an indicator. So sometimes seeing the patterns in behavior that are maladaptive can be like a light bulb going off, like, oh, this student might need some additional supports. Sometimes not having that pattern, for example, students who are not able to come in and like follow your routine or whatever your daily schedule is, or students who can't unlock their locker, or who can't seem to make it to their next class on time. The absence of those patterns can also be indicative of a learning need or disability. So you want to be really in tune to your students and be able to advocate for them. I think it's important for teachers, all teachers, to know that you're your students' biggest advocate. Parents are really the biggest advocates in my opinion, but I think teachers have the potential to be even greater advocates for their students. And so it's really important to be in tune with that. You want to observe, communicate, document, and intervene. So when you notice changes, you want to contact the parents. You want to talk with your colleagues. You want to try simple interventions. So when we think about RTI, you want to engage in simple interventions like moving their seat, or giving them a modified test, or breaking up the work, giving them more time, or examples to kind of see if those supports are helpful. And then you want to document the unmet need. So is it helpful to use these supports, or is the student still struggling? And then you want to reflect on that and kind of go from there. We have multidisciplinary teams that work together to support students who are struggling. The parents are notified, and we explain their rights. And then we talk about moving forward with assessment. So this is kind of the process. If you have identified a student who you think is struggling, what happens next? And so if they qualify, if the student's having difficulty, you talk to the parents, you've used a number of assessment materials, and then the school psychologist administers the test in the child's native language. They identify the child as having a disability that is specifically noted within IDEA. If the answer to that is no, then you have to say, well, does this child have a mental or physical impairment that affects a major life function? If the answer to that is no, then the student is going to go into a regular classroom with no supports. If the answer to that is yes, the student has a mental or physical impairment that affects a major life function, then they're eligible for a 504 plan. So that's how they get to the 504. If they have a disability under IDEA, and that impairment has an adverse effect on their educational performance, then they are eligible for an IEP. Okay, so this, hopefully you can just kind of sit with this and think about this flow chart and how it leads to identification and whether it means a student receives a 504 or an IEP. Parent referrals are another way that students can receive supports under IDEA. So parents can write a letter and requesting an evaluation, and then the timeline starts the day that the principal receives the letter. So on, March 3rd, 2017, if Dr. Martin received this letter, that school system has 90 days to complete this process. Okay, so they have to acknowledge the parent's letter, they have to start the evaluation process, and they have to assess the child. They bring a team together and then decide whether or not they meet the criteria for eligibility, and then they write up the IEP, and the child is placed in the appropriate setting. Okay, so from referral to evaluation, and then you can see how the cycle goes. So that is a 90-day process. So if that process takes more than 90 days, then the school is technically in violation of a federal mandate. So you can kind of see how serious a lot of this is. And although not all parents necessarily engage in due process, many of them probably could if they even understood or knew, what some of these specific requirements are. So what are some of the words that come to mind when you hear IEP? What do you think about when you hear IEP? Do you think about a document? Do you think about a bunch of rules? What comes to mind? Just kind of think about what that means to you, or even what those letters mean, right? So IEPs are individualized education programs, and they are important because they guide the education of students with disabilities, and it really clarifies the expectations for students. So not only from a parent perspective, but from a teacher perspective, it helps everyone on the entire team really, to be in tune with what the students' needs are and how the team plans to meet those needs. So you can see here who is included on the team in this team process, and then you can also see how the school, the student, and the parents work together to achieve the goals as outlined in the IEP. So first, you have annual reviews, and this is where the students' progress towards the goals in the IEP are reviewed, and then either the IEP is changed or it's updated based on the students having met those goals, and then you check that to make sure that the students' best interests are being protected. We also have IEP monitoring and review. So these are 3-year reevaluations. So every 3 years, the student goes up for a re-eval. And IDEA permits existing information to be used. It doesn't require new assessments. And with the parent and team agreement, you don't have to have a new assessment, but parents have to be informed about the 3-year reevaluation, but the consent is not required. So each year you have an IEP meeting, but the student doesn't have to be re-evaluated or reevaluated until every 3 years, just to make sure that's clear. So you'll read more about that in your chapters for this week. Here are the components of the IEP. Again, I'll let you kind of read through some of that, and you can ask more questions if you have questions following this. This is a video that might be helpful for you to kind of look at what the IEP meeting process looks like and the members of the team and how those procedures actually go. So I encourage you to take a moment to watch that video. And then here's another resource that you can click on right up here to see each of the components of the IEP. It's actually I always forget the name of those presentations. I'll think of it in a second. But it's a cool presentation that you can look at to learn more about each of the components of the IEP. And then finally, the biggest goal with IEPs is that they are smart. So we want them to be specific, the goals within the IEPs to be specific, to be measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. So you want to write goals that can actually be measured. You want them to be clear. You don't want to say, Jessica will learn to read, because that is very broad and it doesn't tell anyone how we will help Jessica learn to read, how we will help her meet that goal. So it has to be very clear and very specific. You want to say, Jessica will read level 7 books with 70% proficiency 3 out of 5 days of the week. Okay, that's how specific those goals need to be. And it has to be something that can be attained. It has to be relevant to the child and the classroom setting. And it needs to have some kind of limitation in terms of the time. So when do we plan to achieve this goal? Okay. So IEP services, again, it's not just about a setting. It's about the kind of combination of services that students receive. It's supplemental aids and services. It's, it can be in the regular education classroom. It can be in a resource classroom. It could be in a self-contained classroom. It could even be in separate schools or residential facilities. And sometimes we're serving the needs of students with disabilities in homes and in hospital settings. So when the public school system cannot provide the services that a student needs, they are financially responsible for providing those services to the children in whatever setting is most appropriate for them. So sometimes that means that the public school system is actually paying for a child to go to a private school that is better able to support that child. Okay, so you want to understand that we are required to support them to the best extent, but sometimes there are students whose needs cannot be met in their school, and so we have to make adaptations and adjustments and accommodations when that happens. So I know that I flew through the second part of this presentation because the first part was so long, but if you have more questions or you want to learn a little bit more about IEPs and the IEP process, you can click on this screen capture of a different module for a different class. So I teach a class on managing behavior, and I have an entire presentation here just on IEPs. So you could spend some time clicking through that to learn a little bit more in detail about the individualized education program. Okay. So finally, wrapping up, now that we're about, an hour and 20 minutes in, I promise that the rest of these will not be this long. This one was long because we had to do the intro material first. The rest of these will definitely not be quite so long. As a reminder, if you have not yet completed your orientation, please do upload your introduction to your discussion board. I see that many of you have completed that, so I will go in and get your grades going. So you'll see those in the grade book soon. If you have not yet reviewed the syllabus and the assignments, please do so. And then you want to make sure you sign up for your immersion activity dates. Go ahead and plug your names in for that and get your dates on your calendar so that if you need to make any changes in your schedules, you can accommodate for that, okay? Also, you want to complete the assigned reading for this week. So this week, you're going to read chapters 1 and 2 of your textbook. It's going to give you an introduction and foundation and a background around special education, okay? And hopefully this audio module, this audio lecture will complement what you have read or what you will read in your textbook this week. Next, you want to make sure that you submit your weekly reflection. So it's due on Sunday by 11:55. And I think that's everything. I'm sure there's something I'm forgetting. I'll probably send out some reminders this week. But I believe that's everything. So make sure you have your textbook. If you haven't done your intro, please submit that. I'll give a little leeway this week if anyone's running late. I'll give you until Monday. So if you haven't yet done it, make sure you get that done as soon as possible. Instead of Sunday, I'll let you have until Monday if you haven't submitted your introduction on Moodle. If you have any questions or concerns, please do reach out. Again, I know some of you have probably taken online classes before. For some of you, it might be new. So if you have any questions or concerns, please do reach out. Let me know. And I think that's it. All right. So I hope you have a wonderful week. I am excited to have you in this class, and I look forward to meeting some of you and engaging in all of our class discussions and learning more about you as I finish reading your introductions. All right. So welcome again, and thank you so much for listening.